Good morning. Before we begin, please note that this webinar is being recorded. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on ecological drought and tribal drought resilience. My name is Britt Parker, and I'm a program manager with the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS, at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I'm also joined today by my colleague, Crystal Stiles, who is our Tribal Engagement Coordinator. This webinar is the third in a six-part webinar series that seeks to raise awareness of ecological drought, shared actions that strengthen ecosystem resilience and mitigate the impacts of drought, and highlight the advancements in building tribal drought resilience and preserving natural and cultural resources. This series is co-organized and co-hosted by NIDIS and the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center, or National CASC. Information shared in this webinar series will build on the 2021 National Ecological Drought webinar series, which was also organized by NIDIS and the National CASC. And if you want more information about that webinar series, please check out the information in the chat box. And as I go through today's presentation, you'll see a number of links in the chat box for more information. So definitely pay attention to that. Before we begin, I want to provide a brief overview of NIDIS and the CASC for those that are not familiar with these programs. NIDIS was created by congressional law in 2006 with a mandate to better help the nation prepare for, mitigate, and respond to the effects of drought. NIDIS achieves that goal through the development of regional drought early warning systems, through efforts to improve drought monitoring, prediction, and forecasting, as well as support for effective drought planning, preparedness, and assessing the impacts of drought. All of our work is done in collaboration with a wide range of partners at all levels. I encourage you to explore the U.S. Drought Portal at drought.gov, which is the U.S. government's authoritative drought information website, including information on ecological drought and our work with tribal partners, which is guided by our tribal engagement strategy. The Climate Adaptation Science Centers, also referred to as the CASCs, consist of 1 national and 9 regional centers shown here that cover the United States, the U.S. Caribbean, and the U.S. affiliated Pacific states and islands. The CASC brings together scientists and natural and cultural resource managers united under a common goal of helping fish, wildlife, land, water, and people adapt to a changing climate. The CASCs use an actionable science model to generate climate science and tools to help partners develop adaptation strategies that meet on-the-ground needs. They work directly with partners to identify priority issues and develop research plans and produce impactful science products. Transitioning to our webinar today, one way that NIDIS meets the needs set forth in our public law is to fund competitive applied research. Since 2007, we've funded more than 70 innovative drought research projects through the Coping with Drought Research Competition. Research through the Coping with Drought competition has assessed the impacts of drought on agriculture, water resources, and tourism and recreation, and developed decision support tools for regional, tribal, state, and local use. Recent competitions have focused on improving our understanding and management of drought risk in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, as well as supporting tribal nations in building drought resilience. Competitions are designed to respond to needs identified across our regional drought early warning systems through national initiatives and in working closely with our partners. As I mentioned, this is the third of 6 webinars in this series, and we'll be highlighting the outcomes of 12 projects over the next 4 months from our Coping with Drought grants. We hope that you will join us for future webinars and consider listening to past webinar recordings if they're of interest to you. Today's webinar is entitled Integrating Ecological Drought Considerations into Restoration Efforts and Natural Resource Management. The focus will be on ecological drought research and collaborative efforts to inform terrestrial and coastal restoration efforts, sharing the outcomes from 3 of our grant teams. I want to introduce the speakers now, and then we'll get started. Our first presentation, entitled Projecting Socio-Ecological Impacts of Drought in Southwestern Ecosystems to prioritize restorations initiatives, will feature Sara and Diana Stuart. Sara's a plant ecologist and conservation biologist, and Diana is a social scientist. Both are professors at the School of Earth and Sustainability at Northern Arizona University. Our second presentation, Drought Effects on Coastal Restoration Success, Quantifying Impacts and Testing Strategies to Enhance Resilience, will feature Anna Braswell, who's a coastal ecosystem ecologist out of the University of Florida and Florida Sea Grant. Anna uses observational, experimental, and geospatial approaches to understand the resilience of coastal ecosystems. Our final presentation is an integrated framework for drought response in Southern California's natural landscapes, featuring Megan Jennings, who's a research ecologist at San Diego State University and co-directs the Institute for Ecological Monitoring and Management at SDSU. Her research and the work of the Institute is focused on providing science in service of conservation, natural resource management, and resilience planning and implementation in California. Throughout the webinar, all participants are muted. So if you have questions for our speakers, please write your questions in the question box in your GoToWebinar panel. If your question is specific to one speaker, please note the name of the speaker with your question. We will try to address a couple questions after each speaker, and we will have time after all presentations for a longer Q&A and discussion. So let's get started with our first speakers, Sara Souther and Diana Stuart.
Thank you for that introduction, Britt. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sara Souther, and I'm joined by my colleague, Diana Stuart. Our other collaborator, Dr. Chischilly of Navajo Technical University, could not be with us today. Our project focuses on understanding how ecological drought affects culturally important species in the Southwestern United States and how this knowledge can guide restoration initiatives. Next slide, please. Oh, Britt, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Sorry, I was on the screen.
I'm sorry, I should have checked before I launched in. Thank you. Okay. So the Southwest is one of the most water limited regions in the United States. This map is from just last week, taken from the Drought Monitor website, and it shows what has become a familiar sight in the region. Nearly the entire state is in some form of drought. Since 2000, the year 2000, this region has been in the midst of a multi-decadal mega drought, the driest in at least 1,200 years. Paleoclimate records show that past mega droughts lasted decades or centuries, but what makes this current drought unique is really its severity. Next slide, please. Even within the context of this mega drought, the drought of 2020 to 2021 was exceptionally severe. The figure that you're looking at shows vapor pressure deficit through time. VPD is the gap between how much water vapor the air could hold if fully saturated and how much it actually holds. So the higher VPD indicates drier air, which increases stress, of course, on plants. These types of drought events are predicted to only become more frequent and severe in the future. Next slide, please. During this drought event, we observed widespread die-off across multiple species, not just isolated mortality, but really landscape level impacts that could be observed in aerial photography or just by folks driving along the highway. So this drought event really was a signal for us to get out into the field and start working on this issue. And it provided a window to study how ecosystems respond when really pushed to their limits. Next slide. In Arizona, ecological impacts of drought are intertwined with cultural harm. Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes whose lands cover nearly a quarter of the state, with, of course, their ancestral lands covering the entire state. Many indigenous cultures here rely on natural resources as a food source, of course, but they're also critically important for ceremonies and cultural practices. So given this, our project asked, how can we identify areas most vulnerable to drought, and how can we integrate cultural priorities to guide restoration and land management? And the goal of our work really is to identify places where ecological resistance or resilience overlaps with cultural importance, creating opportunities for collaborative restoration. Next slide, please. So we used the 2020 drought as a natural experiment to evaluate resilience and recovery. We paired ecological data from 3 culturally important tree species. They're shown here: pinyon, emery oak, and Douglas fir, with interviews and social data from tribal communities. These 3 species have known strong cultural ties, and they occur across an elevational gradient as well as a precipitation gradient, with emery oak occurring at the lowest part of the elevation and Douglas fir at the highest. Next slide, please. I'm going to describe the ecological side of the project, then I'm going to hand the presentation over to Diana, who will be able to talk to you more about the social science and methods and share her preliminary results. But I'm going to get us oriented here first to the ecology side. So what you're looking at is a map of our study area. We established 135 plots across 3 ecoregions, again corresponding to those focal species. In each plot, we collected overstory and understory composition, as well as demographic data on the focal tree species. Next slide, please. We are actually pursuing a number of analyses. It's sort of overwhelming, but our first step was to take a comprehensive approach to examine the ecosystem as a whole in order to understand drivers of resilience and recovery to drought. To do this, we tested multiple hypotheses using structural equation modeling, which is a really nice approach for studying complex ecological systems because it allows us to examine both direct and indirect pathways of influence. So we measured recovery in 2 ways. We looked at NDVI in this case, which is just an estimate of greenness that captures ecosystem productivity. And we also looked at community dissimilarity from our plot data, looking at how species composition has shifted after drought. We then built and compared a series of models that emphasized different suites of variables, including models that focused on direct drought impacts, direct interactions or drought interactions with fire history, the post-drought climate environment, ecosystem resilience, which was really looking at kind of the diversity, the species diversity and structure. And then we included a comprehensive model that integrated all those factors together. And this framework allowed us to test drought, of course, whether drought in these systems is really influencing community trajectories, but it also gave us an opportunity to look at how and through which mechanisms resilience emerges in these systems. Next slide, please. Okay, here I'm showing a best supported model of drought recovery in oak systems, which indicates that climate change and the post-drought environment, rather than the severity of drought itself, drove recovery in terms of primary production. Notably, none of our models predicted recovery in terms of community change, and broadly, we saw a significant decline in diversity in the understory post-drought relative to the overstory. Overall, this figure illustrates that the interplay of climate and diversity, because you can see that in all cases, species diversity and canopy cover were mediators of these different climatic effects, really determined oak resilience and recovery from drought. Okay, I'm going to ask Brett to advance the slide, and then I'm going to hand it over to Diana.
Hi, I'm a sociologist, and Sara asked me to join this project to look into more of the cultural aspects with 2 different indigenous tribes in Arizona. Well, Western Apache is actually a group of different tribes, and then the Navajo Nation. In addition to looking at the locations that are really important for harvesting, as sociologists, we're really interested in other barriers to continued harvesting in addition to drought. It could be other ecological barriers or social barriers. And so we added these additional research questions, just wanting to have a deeper understanding of the cultural importance of these 2 different tree species. So we did not look at Doug fir in our social science, but we looked at the relationship between Western Apache and emery oak and Navajo and pinyon pine. So looking at the cultural importance, also how is this environmental change affecting harvest, but then what are these other barriers? Our research methods for the Western Apache tribes and Navajo Nation were different combinations of personal interviews, focus groups, and then mapping to identify key areas. We're still working on our mapping data, but I'm going to talk about some other findings that we have already discovered. So next slide, please. So we found some similarities between Western Apache tribes' use of emery oak acorns and Navajo use of pinyon pine. For both of them, they're used as a food source. So eating the seeds of the pinyon pine and the acorns of the emery oak have been traditional food sources for centuries and are very important, not only for a source of protein and for a healthy diet, but also in both cases used in ceremonies. These are a picture of a sunrise ceremony, which is a coming of age ceremony for Western Apache tribes, and in different ceremonies for Navajo Nation. They are also important. Our interviews and focus groups revealed that drought and heat is having a significant effect on the quality and quantity of both the pinyon pine nuts and the emery oak acorns. Respondents said they're getting smaller, they're getting drier, and some of them aren't usable for food. So that's an increasing trend that impacts the traditional uses of these trees. We also discovered additional challenges to continued harvest is just the transportation. Some of these harvest sites are really far away. The fuel to get there is a lot, and as a big time commitment to travel to harvesting sites. And also, both members of the Navajo Nation and Western Apache tribes described discrimination at harvest sites, people making them feel unwanted, they shouldn't be there picking acorns or gathering pinyon nuts. In both cases, we see social factors and environmental factors leading to less harvesting. And those who do harvest are increasingly selling the pinyon nuts and the emery acorns, and since less people are harvesting them, and the prices of these as a commodity are going up. And we're also concerned because less harvesting is a very important group activity. That's family time, passing on intergenerational knowledge about the ecosystems and just also about other cultural traditions. And that is a loss if people don't go harvesting as much. Next slide. And lastly, I just want to point out that these are different tribal groups, different tree species. So of course there was also differences. For the Western Apache tribes, emery oak acorns are really part of their identity, with many respondents telling us we are acorn people. Also, something that's different is that because rain patterns are shifting in Arizona, that's impacting the ability to do acorn harvest. If the monsoons come at different times, it creates a narrow window for harvesting. That makes it even bigger challenge for Western Apache tribes to harvest acorns. And lastly, we found that in addition to food and ceremonial uses for Navajo, pinyon pine is used in lots of different things. It's used in pottery. The sap is used to seal in cracks to make pottery waterproof. And also they use sap in salves and medicinal uses. So we found a lot so far, and it's been really interesting research. Next slide. The main implications of this is what we're doing the locations to find out where we should prioritize restoration, but we're really seeing that because there's impacts on the acorns and the pinyon nuts, that these restoration efforts could have a really big impact on helping to continue the harvest and use of these traditional species. Also, we have found that it would be useful to have more recognition in public areas, say that are closer to cities or in public lands, that this harvesting is traditional and welcomed to reduce discrimination. And also loss of participants in harvesting could be addressed through those last 2 points, just engaging more youth and having more aid from other organizations. All right, next slide.
Okay, I'll take over here and keep this fast. So we're currently in the process of mapping ecological resilience and combining that data with results from our social science interviews to identify important harvest areas that may be threatened or particularly resilient to drought. So at the bottom of the screen, you can see a draft social map that identifies key harvest areas based on this interview data. It incorporates both specific harvest sites as well as metrics that we derive related to harvest accessibility that were mentioned in the interviews. So after we build both ecological and social maps, we'll hold community meetings to evaluate these maps, allowing community members to provide feedback and up or down weight particular variables prior to sharing our results with land managers. Next slide, please. These maps will then directly inform management decisions. We already are very closely partnered with the Emery Oak Collaborative Tribal Restoration Initiative, which is a collaborative group who's implementing prescribed fire and fuel reduction at Emery Oak sites across Apache ancestral lands in Arizona. And so they are ready to take our information and put it into action on the ground right away. Next slide, please. So this project offers several important implications or benefits. It supports tribal sovereignty and cultural continuity by identifying and protecting harvest areas. It provides land managers with science-based map-ready guidance for restoration priorities. And finally, this work really advances our understanding of ecological drought and resilience mechanisms in the Southwest. Taken together, this work demonstrates how ecological drought research can directly support community resilience goals. Next slide, please. And with that, we just want to recognize our partners who we are deeply grateful to. These include our tribal partners, of course, the Forest Service, who we work really closely with as the kind of predominant land managers of these forested areas in Arizona, Navajo Technical University, and of course, NIDIS. And we're happy to take any questions if we have time for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Sara and Diana. We don't have any questions right now, so we'll go ahead to pass this over to our next presenter, Anna Braswell, and we'll have more questions and discussions at the end. And I do apologize. I think there's a lag between when I change slides and when you see them, so my apologies. There's a bit of a lag.
I'm sorry. I know I was waiting and I felt
no,
like maybe I should just jump in. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there does seem to be a little lag. Okay, Anna, that looks great.
Good.
Take it away.
You can hear me okay as well?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks so much for having me. My name is Anna Braswell. I'm out of the University of Florida and Florida Sea Grant, and I just want to first acknowledge the amazing collaborators that we've had on this project, in particular my co-PIs, Kerstin, Wasson, Monique Fountain, and Margaret Zimmer, as well as a bevy of undergrads, graduate students, people that work for Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, and volunteers that have really helped for these projects. And of course, thank you, NIDIS, for funding this as well. So just to jump in, I want to introduce our study site just for a bit. We are working at Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is a tidal estuary in Monterey Bay, about 50 miles south of San Francisco in San Francisco Bay. And it is about a 7-mile long estuary, as you can see in the picture here on the right-hand side. And it has historically has had extensive marshes, but as well has been affected quite a bit by human alterations, which I will get into in our next slide here. So Elkhorn Slough through the years has lost much of its wetlands. Over 50% of the slough's marshes have been lost, mainly due to human alteration. So if you look at the picture to the left, the map to the left from 1870, you can see really extensive salt marshes in this area with the bright green. And as you go to 2000, those salt marshes has really just been just in certain areas. And we mainly see salt marsh or salt mudflats. And this is due to both diking and also hydrological alteration. There's a railway that goes through the slough now, as well as roads. And also the Salinas River, which was the main input into the estuary, was redirected. And so a lot of the sediment coming into the estuary has been lost. So there's just a lot of issues with drowning of these salt marshes in the area. And just to point out where our study site that we're talking about that I will be talking about for the rest of this presentation is, it's in this yellow circle here. It's called Hester Marsh. It's a historically diked marsh that is the subject of all the restoration efforts in the slough. So Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, mainly under the leadership of Monique Fountain, has proposed this really novel restoration effort that would be something they're calling thick layer addition. I know a lot of people in the coastal ecosystem world have heard of thin layer placement, which is the distribution of sediment on and then a couple of centimeter layers onto a marsh to help with keeping elevation relative to sea level rise. But this project is thick layers, so really adding a half meter of sediment on top of a marsh to make it ready for the future. So this is a climate ready marsh, ready for sea level rise 50 years from now. So it was really constructed using heavy machinery. The hill slopes were scraped in order to have sediment for these places, and is just a bit different from thin layer placement in those construction efforts. And you can see here pictures of that efforts going along, mainly funded by NOAA grants for this project. And what happened was taking this area that was mainly mud flat. So on the left-hand side in 2010, you can see that most of the area was a mud flat, no vegetation, just fringing vegetation along the sides, and move it into a high marsh setting. So on the right-hand side in 2023, you can see all of the green high marsh. So it's a really an elevated system. It gets inundated probably once a month or maybe a couple of times a month, not a daily inundation pattern, and ready for sea level rise in the future rather than sea level rise right now. And I should also point out with this is that there's been a couple of phases of this project. We're mainly looking at phase 1 and phase 2 right here, but there's also phase 3 that's happened more recently. And today I'm going to be mainly talking about phase 1 and phase 2. And I just want to mention that because that will come into play in future slides. Okay, so what happened? There was this massive restoration effort, particularly phase 1, and then the mega droughts in California happened and affected it right as that restoration site was opening and being planted. And really through those drought years is when that site was being restored. So dealing with those the new site, as well as these stressor variables and environmental conditions that are not very conducive to plants coming and growing in that site. So that led to really patchy colonization of plants in the site. You can see here that there are a lot of plants along the tidal creeks where you do have that more daily inundation, but that up on the marsh platform, there's patchy vegetation and big bare areas. And so this is where this project and our team came in, was saying, okay, there's obviously been this huge drought stressor. What happened? What are the things that are driving these patterns? But also, what are some of the restoration adaptation strategies that we can use to address what we're seeing in the field and move it towards something that might be better colonized? So thinking about these climate adaptation trade-offs really between marsh elevation, which is and a high marsh elevation, which is addressing one climate adaptation to sea level rise, or one climate stressor, sea level rise, but really made it probably more vulnerable to another climate stressor and drought. So that's where our project came in, to try to look at these things with the SLU, with the Elkhorn National Estuarine Research Reserve, to come up with some strategies. So we came up with this kind of conceptual diagram, looking at restoration trajectories and trying to understand where we were in this. So this is restoration success on the left-hand side from low to high, and the years since the construction was completed along the x-axis. And we kind of thought, okay, if you do have rain and abundance of rain, you might have early success where you see really the plants thriving and you get to high restoration success early and sustain that. It might be something more steady where you don't have huge bumper crop years, but it's just gradually progressing. Or in a drought condition, you might see something like late success where you have many years of not so great colonization from the plants, but then as those plants build up a better environment through adding organic matter and adding the conditions that they need, that you might have late success for that. So we wanted to test this idea, as well as look at ways to maybe bump something that's in a late success trajectory into something more steady or early success. So I'm just going to briefly go over some of our approaches. This is a very big project with many components, so will be very brief and limited, but if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them in the end. And I'm also going to color code each box so that when I show the results, you might be able to follow which part I'm talking about through the results. So the first things that we looked at were how transplants, so this site, we planted transplants of different species of salt marsh plants into the site, and as well as those recruits of those plants into the site naturally. So we track those through different years to try to understand what the patterns of success were for those transplants and recruits. Next, we did a watering experiment. So we set up irrigation sprinklers and tried to see if we could add fresh water to the system to try to ameliorate some of the drought stress and to get those plants thriving. We also have been working on a seed addition experiment, trying to use seeds as a way to add a lower cost way to boost up the vegetation in this site and add increased vegetation to it. The next thing that we did was using coring as well as some wells to look at the soil and hydrology of the area to try to characterize what might be stressful in the environment, why we're seeing the patterns of bare and vegetated areas like we are, and how we might deal with those conditions. So just to talk about the transplants, this is a paper that was led by Kerstin that got published this year in Ecosphere. And we took the same trajectories, thinking about early success, steady success, or late success, and looked at our data to see how those transplants had done over time and how those recruits have done over time. And so this is percent colonization, which is a measure of success. So if you get to 100% colonization, you're completely full of plants on the y-axis, and years, looking at just both dry and wet years on the x-axis. And you can see that the years, or the plantings that were planted in dry years, so like the ones that were planted in year 1, tended to not reach a high level of colonization, maybe 25 or 30%, and that was sustained over time, possibly showing late success. Whereas those planted in years that were wet, like year 5 or year 3, moving into year 4, seemed to do a little bit better when they had those wet years, showing that those might be more of an early success or a steady or an early success example where they were able to reach a higher level of colonization because of those wet years and the water, really pointing to water being really important for these plants in this restoration area. We also, again, looked at watering. So this is some of the surprising results that we had from watering. This is an example of a failed experiment from our first year in phase 1, which is our most stressful conditions. It's the one that went in during the phase that went in during the mega drought. And as you can see here, the watering just did not do anything. We had 0 plants left in this watering, and we're really surprised by that, and also seeming salt crust from that watering as well. So really surprising results to begin with, but it seemed like that the phase did matter because this is phase 2. These plants were also put in during a wet year, so that might have been some part of it, but you can see that it's much less patchy, and we had greater success with the plants. in phase 2. And when we look at that in the data, we can see that it really depended on species and area about how that watering effect helped. So this is looking at the final size of the plant on the y-axis and whether it was watered or not, and whether it was in a stressful or non-stressful soil area. So removed soil was non-stressful and added soil was stressful. And for something like Disticculus, which is one of the plants we looked at, you don't really see a watering effect, but you do see this really important effect of where it was planted. So the more benign soil conditions seem to be important for how big the plant was. And when you look at something like Frankinia, there is a watering effect, but that benign area was maintained in these results. So moving on to the hydrology, we looked at the water content here on the x-axis and then bare and vegetated areas across the site, and tried to see how much the water content of the soil might be driving those patterns. And we do see that there's this difference between vegetated and bare areas, with vegetated areas having more water content, but there's also a difference between areas of the site and environmental conditions in the site, with east and west being, again, a different environmental conditions also playing a role in that water content. Again, we looked at seeds to try to develop a way to better increase the restoration success of these places, trying to understand how we could add seeds, because seeds were just spreading seeds was unsuccessful in these sites. And for salt marshes, it's not a very traditional technique to be used in restoration because of the tidal inundation and the seeds washing away. So we looked at different ways to do that. And just to summarize what this is work led by Bethany Lee, what Bethany has found, looking at the critical stages of seed addition, both the sourcing of seeds, the storage of seeds, the pre-treatment of seeds, and the sowing of seeds and seedling establishment, we found that it's really important to think about where your seeds are coming from, because different populations of plants have different viabilities, with some having very low viability of seeds and some very high. So testing that is important. Both refrigerated storage and cold water or saltwater stress stratification is important, because those seeds need that salt water and that cold to simulate a tide coming in and being on the tide to really germinate. They should be surface sown, no burial, and that they need moderate to high water availability. So with this information, Monique was able to do a site in phase 3 that just recently came online in the restoration, where she dammed up an area and put water in it, put seeds out, and it was some of our most successful seeding yet. You can see these green squares here where all the seeds are coming up. So it was really exciting to be able to provide, to see our results coming into practice right away and seeing such successful results with that. This is just an example of something that we're working on now. We're going to be turning these results into some decision trees to help restoration practitioners, when they do have drought stress, to come up with various experiments that they might do and try to understand what their solutions might be if they're dealing with similar situations that we are, because we've been working with both an advisory panel and the Tidal Wetlands Program, as well as other interested people that are working in salt marsh restoration, to try to understand what some other people are dealing with and how we might use this data to be more helpful to those sources of people. And finally, just to give some basic lessons learned, the results of experiments may surprise you. I mean, we've had very surprising results with the watering and things like amendments, and that's exactly why we should do them. And that's exactly why partnering with recent restoration practitioners is so important. Irrigation or watering can mitigate drought stress under certain conditions, but not every condition, and knowing what your conditions are like in your particular site might be important before you add that watering. Harnessing wet years is very important, so building that adaptive capacity into a restoration plan might be important to be able to harness those wet years. And large experiments can be added as part of a later adaptive management, and that has also been very important for this site for later success, as you could see in the phase 3, where some of the things that we've been experimenting with are being put into practice, and we're seeing some exciting results. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Anna. And we have some great questions coming in, but we are going to move to our last presenter just to make sure we get through all of our presentations, and then we'll go to questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Megan Jennings.
Thank you, Britt. Can you hear me all right?
I can.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's my privilege to be able to go after these two other presentations because they set the stage for a little bit of what I'm going to be talking about, our project on ecological drought in Southern California, where we've been developing a framework for drought preparedness as well as proactive response. Next slide, please. So this project is a collaboration of San Diego State, where I sit, along with the Climate Science Alliance, which is a boundary spanning organization really helping to do outreach, engagement, and help with partner connections, the Desert Research Institute, the Western Regional Climate Center, and the Climate Hazard Center at UC Santa Barbara. And of course, we're very thankful to NOAA for the funding for this work. Next slide. And these partners are all coming together to help lead this project. On the top, you see our project team that leads myself, my colleague Rebecca Lewison here at San Diego State, postdoctoral researcher Ellie Gay, who is helping to lead a lot of this work now, and my colleague Amber Paris, who sits at both the Climate Science Alliance and Desert Research Institute. So those of us at the top focus more on ecology and climate adaptation. And then below you see our science advisors, Dan McAvoy and Shrat Shukla, who are providing some climate science expertise to our project. So we're thankful to have this collaboration as we move along through the project. Next slide. So this all started through some of the work that we had previously been doing on a project called the Connecting Wildlands and Communities project. This was really focused on planning for climate-ready landscapes, connecting things that we were thinking about in natural landscapes to the built environment. And one of the things we did through this is we had a whole lot of engagement, in particular with jurisdictional planners, which was a bit new for those of us who are ecologists. And then, of course, we brought along our conservation and natural resource community. And in these conversations and collaborations, we really were highlighting some of the gaps in not necessarily information, but getting information into implementation. And so from this project, we decided to build on, because we were hearing a lot about the need for more connection to start to plan for not only drought, but also extreme precipitation, because we face both in Southern California. Next slide. And I'm about to show you what that looks like. In Southern California, we have average rainfall, but really that average is not something we experience on a regular basis. Instead, we experience these extremes, and the mean is a byproduct of that. So in these maps, you'll see it circled in red. We have the greatest amount of variability, so the darker the color, the greater the variability in precipitation of the entire United States here in Southern California. Again, this is because we have these boom or bust cycles. And then, relatedly, on the map on the right, you'll see that that also affects our stream flow. So, this is affecting our entire landscapes, and it's particularly prevalent in our riparian and watershed environments. Next slide. And this really came up in that prior project that I mentioned as we were looking at things like climatic water deficit. And what you see here is a map comparing what that change in water deficit looks like. And that's just the available water for plants, really. What that looks like in the recent past, starting in about the 1980s, compared to what we expect to be coming our way by the middle of the century. So we're getting close to being there. And what you see is a map that moves from sort of neutral and a fair amount of green to being largely brown, meaning a lot drier. We're experiencing more dryness in our environment. And as you heard about just in the last presentation about restoration success and plants and ecosystem resilience, that can really have a large effect. Next slide. And again, it's not that there's a lack of information. There's a lot of existing drought guidance and actions. You can see some of those represented here in California. Some of those focus on agricultural drought or meteorological drought, or they're focused on forests. And there's been more focused on this ecological drought, in part thanks to NIDIS and the effort to promote this work. But there's been the disconnect for our partners who are in management situations where they need that information to be relevant to where they are and how they do their work. So we really needed to meet them where they are. Next slide. So in this work, our goal was really to build a community of practice. Unfortunately, we already had that community of practice from a lot of our prior work, and it was just figuring out who was the right fit to help guide us and advise us, and then who were the folks who needed the information. So we have an advisory group that's been working with us to tell us what it is they need and how we can best deliver. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how we're working together on that. And this has really been, I think, impactful because it's allowed us to combine the science and information with the experience on the ground. And it's also helping people to connect to one another, where they can ask each other, you know, hey, how do you deal with this situation? Does anybody have monitoring plans they feel like are effective for this? So that was an important part of how we wanted to structure this. So this is state, federal agencies, tribal governments, nonprofits, water management agencies are some of our key partners here. Next slide. And what we've been doing with them is using an approach to think about scenario-based planning, and we've been co-producing this. So together, we've been talking about what are the key management issues that our land and resource managers are facing related to drought or extreme precipitation, selecting the relevant data to be able to plan and manage for that, developing management scenarios so we can say, here's a situation, what would you do in that situation? And then using those scenarios and those responses to get to actual management strategies that can help this community of practice have more of a common ground to move from, so that there's more strength in being able to overcome some of the challenges that people are facing in dealing with ecological drought. Next slide, please. So we started by asking, what are those barriers to planning and action? And we asked this both at a larger kickoff meeting with a lot of folks, and then asked this specifically of our advisors. And one of the things we heard, and if you look at the graph on the left, the thing that was less of an issue was the lack of information on impacts. People felt like there was information, but it's a little bit of what I call the salad dressing aisle conundrum, where if you have so many choices and there's so many things to consider, you have a bit of analysis paralysis. You're not exactly sure what is the right fit and how to move forward. And really, if you look at the bottom of that chart on the left, lack of a strategic plan, lack of budgetary flexibility, both of which are related, right? If you don't have a plan, it's hard to argue for how you need more budgetary flexibility to deal with drought, to make the decision to pause a restoration project in a drought year, for example. If you don't have good information and a good plan that incorporates that information. So this is where we wanted to help address the issue. And then on the right, you can see we asked folks, so, you know, they're saying that they have a lack of ability to incorporate predictions into management. So we were asking them, what did they use? And the majority weren't actually using any of NOAA's drought tracking information. And again, I think it was in part because there was an issue about figuring out what was the right fit and what applied to what people were doing. And so that's where we come in and trying to pull these pieces together in a way that, again, meets people where they are. Next slide. So we asked people, what did they want to see in a drought response strategy? What would be emphasized? And so conservation, habitat restoration, biodiversity, groundwater, that's a sticky wicket here in Southern California, but people wanted to know more about that as that plays an important role. But then also collaboration, working together to be more adaptive and resilient. Next slide. So we started to drill down and think about what were the management concerns, and we took what people had given to us, and we identified that there were sort of four main themes. People were interested in hydrologic functioning, human communities, ecosystem functioning integrity, and wildfire risk. On the right-hand side, you can see a word cloud of all those really specific things that fed into those four main categories, but that's how we're moving forward in thinking about how we give people the information that they need. Next slide. So we've been taking those sort of main guideposts and thinking about how can we scale regionally relevant data, not necessarily making new data, but making the data that currently exists available and accessible, focusing on the drivers of change, things like fire and precipitation, the values at risk like threatened and endangered species and riparian areas, and then working on developing vulnerabilities and metrics that people can track. Next slide. And this is an example of one way we've done this in a past project that we're transferring into this approach that we're working on now, where we looked at refugia, so areas that are buffered from the impacts of climate change, and we looked at these from different domains in the landscape. And on the lower left, you see water. So what makes places more resilient in terms of water availability. So things like naturalness of streams and amount of precipitation an area receives, how much available water is there. And we did this across multiple stressors. And what we're planning to do in this project is very similarly take some of these key themes that I showed you before and identify those important metrics and be able to combine them into something like what you see at the top, this combined refugia, to help people think about either component parts like you see on the bottom, or this as an entire landscape scale approach or concern. Next slide. I'm showing you this again to say we're also using this structure to help us develop those management scenarios I told you, so we could think about how people wanted to adapt. Next slide. So what we want to do is tie the data, the spatial data and the information across the landscape to the actions. What are you going to do? How do you decide what to do? And so we've created in past projects, and we're carrying this forward into this project, an adaptation menu where you scale from at the highest level course scale strategies, and then you drill down a little bit more into approaches, and then further you get into on the ground tactics. What are you actually doing on the ground, prescriptive actions? And we've been doing this, there's examples of this pulling strictly from the literature, but in this case, we started from managers telling us what they would do in those specific scenarios. So we could start from that very realistic management focused approach, and then we can pull in the literature to help support what they're doing and provide good resources for them to make these plans that clearly they've demonstrated and have mentioned they're concerned about those plans are lacking. And the other piece about this I want to point out is on the lower left side, you'll see resistance, resilience, and transition. And these are really just to help managers situate what kind of action are you trying to take, something that will buffer change, something that will help you adjust more to be able to absorb the impacts of change, or are you at some threshold where transitioning to a different system, a different state, something that still provides ecological resilience is the best approach. And so we're working to develop this. And if you go to the next slide, we've already summarized this first level of those adaptation strategies. So again, you'll see these themes that I showed in those big bubbles, things like reducing the risk and long-term impacts of severe disturbances. There's been a lot of concern about invasive species. We want to maintain ecosystem function and prioritize climate vulnerable species. At the bottom, you'll see we also have some strategies that are about collaboration and monitoring and sort of informing the way that we do things. So it's kind of two-pronged, that we're focused both on the management on the ground, but also sort of the social and cultural systems that we work in to make sure that this works for people. We've been really successful at doing this in another project focused on montane forests. And again, this is the highest level of strategies. Next will be approaches, and then we'll drill down into those tactics. But this has been really effective way to connect from the data, what you see on the landscape, all the way to what are you doing on the ground to respond. And it's been really helpful to co-produce this with our advisory group and the people who are practitioners as part of that group, because it's based largely on their experiences, what they actually do on the ground. So we're not creating new things, but we're figuring out how to be strategic in the things that they are already doing. So move to the next slide and I'll wrap up here. So really this is about helping everyone respond to ecological drought, harnessing the vast amount of information. For example, there's a whole lot of drought metrics. Which one fits for my problem and the landscape that I'm working on? That may be something that we need to help a manager get to, right? The information is there, but we need to make it accessible and again, meet people where they are. And part of that is also understanding they have a lot of important knowledge and experience and information. This is particularly true of our tribal partners that have managed land that are their ancestral lands and reservation lands since time immemorial. So how can we build that in, that important traditional knowledge, place-based knowledge? How do we build that in? So we've been focusing on doing that through this project. And I think this helps us get to response and adaptation strategies that are both short and long-term. Those responses may be short. What are we doing when we think drought is coming this year? What are we doing in the next 3 months or 6 months? But then also those adaptation strategies. What are we doing over the next 5 years or 10 years to make sure these systems are more resilient overall? We're trying to mitigate impacts on the short term, but on the long term, how do we make these systems more resilient? How do we do that together? Because drought does not know any boundaries. Also, the idea of monitoring. I think probably everyone would agree that is a challenge and we need to do more of that together. So how can we do that? By working collaboratively with these partnerships. And then finally, building flexibility and adaptive management into our work. Next slide. So with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions anyone may have.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. And we've got some great questions in the chat. So first of all, thank you to all of our speakers for their excellent presentations. Go ahead and enter your questions in the chat. And Crystal, I'm going to turn it over to you to ask some of the questions we have in the next 5 or so minutes.
Sure, sounds good. So we're going to start with first presentation to the last. So I'm going to start with, there was one question for Sara and Diana, whichever one wants to answer. It's kind of a several multi-part question. Do the tribes have input on the maps prior to creation, and are sacred sites or areas of culturally sensitive areas or protective areas considered? And finally, are the tribes notified if they are mapped?
Hi, those are all, so this is Sara. Those are all excellent questions. Yeah, so in fact, a lot of this work was actually driven by our tribal partners. So I have been working for a while now with the Western Apache tribes in particular. And then we, of course, through this grant have started to form connections with Navajo Nation, as well as some of the other tribes in the area. And so one of the things that kept coming up was, you know, the elders, as a part of our collaborative group, we had identified a couple of places where we're like, okay, these are our first, like, let's go to and treat these areas and start, you know, looking at how restoration is improving oak performance. This is particularly with the emery oak. And of course, the idea with a lot of these treatments is we've allowed, in the Western United States, we've had all of these trees grow up and kind of that are not fire adapted. They're in competition with our oaks, which are fire adapted. And this is all a result of us excluding fire from these systems over, you know, the last century. And now we're starting to try to mitigate that and ameliorate those effects. So we kind of started there, and then our tribal partners are like, oh my gosh, what do we do next? Like, where do we go next, and how can we do this appropriately? And so that's how this really came about. It was like, okay, yeah, we're seeing, during my presentation, I showed you one picture of major die-off. Those were emery oaks, actually. So we saw this incredible die-off of these trees, and it was really kind of like a spur to action, with the idea that restoration kind of frees up water resources for the remaining tree species. So I meet very regularly with the tribes. They are absolutely integrated in all parts of this, both through the ideation of the project, and then, yes, so the kind of framework was we go through and we talk to a ton of elders, we map it, and then actually in October, although I think we might have bumped back to November, we are going to bring everybody all together again, and we're going to go through those maps one by one and look at the weighting systems, what they're thinking, you know, is appropriate. We actually had we hosted a whole meeting on burning and restoration with the Western Apache tribes, and sacred sites came up. But the interesting thing there was you know, it might be a place to prioritize for more or less of a reason, but they don't want to exclude treatment from those areas. Those areas are kind of, you know, have been identified through the process of identifying these oak groves. So I guess I could say they're like tangentially incorporated into our selection because some of the oak groves that were selected are within kind of sacred sites, but they don't really want them. They want them to be treated naturally to allow fires to come back into the system and things like that. So unfortunately, the first kind of step towards to kind of getting back to those processes and those historic fire regimes, all of that stuff, is to do this kind of thinning work, so that when we reintroduce fire, it doesn't all go up in flames. So I guess that was a long-winded question, but like this has been something that we work on continuously, and we're kind of always in a back and forth with folks. And yeah, so there's nothing goes by, anything that would be published also totally goes by and goes through the elder oversight committee who, thinks about all of those things and can identify any information that they wouldn't want to get out, but no publication would also include like a named sacred site on it. So I hope that answers your question.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think if our speakers can stay on a couple minutes, we'll keep answering questions. But before we do, I just want to flag that if you've enjoyed this webinar and aren't on our listservs, there'll be a link in the chat. There's also this QR code to subscribe to our different mailing lists. Our next webinar will be on October 16th, so we hope you'll join us. And just know that a webinar recap along with the recording will be available on drought.gov and will be sent to all of you as well. So I'll just say that for those that do need to drop off, and for those who can stay for a few minutes longer, we'll keep on with a few questions.
Thanks, Britt. There was Sarah, there's a follow-up from Paula to your question. She was asking to see how the culturally sensitive areas are mapped and kept secure, because in her experience, people know, that it's detrimental to the site. So just asking if that's being kept secure.
Yeah, so we've done some other let's see. Well, most of these sites are, on Forest Service land, so they're public areas, and it's a little bit different. This isn't like ARC sites. These are stands of trees that most people probably wouldn't really, I'm not sure that it would draw in. Basically, we've discussed this. We've discussed a lot of privacy issues and things along those lines. And obviously, we're not highlighting like this is exactly where you should go to harvest emery oak acorns. So nothing is being published in that level of detail that might interfere with harvest. But it hasn't been in this particular case, because of the situation, because of the oaks being these large, like masting species that produce tons of acorns. Everyone tends to descend on the different areas where acorns are being harvested. And it's really, a tree that occurs on a lot of different land use types. It isn't as if there's nothing particularly sensitive about the information. And this is not coming from me, this is coming from tribal folks. So this isn't something like, I don't know, like the harvest of OSHA or something along those lines where it's rare and heavily sought out and folks might go and descend upon it and remove it from the ground. So I don't know exactly how to say it. We wouldn't post like particularly sacred sites, but a lot of that information on emery oak occurrence, which is what we're really talking about, most of the maps that we've made are actually just looking at things like focusing on access, which anyone could do. So like what groves are close to the road, what groves occur on relatively stable, like flat slopes, what groves are closest to communities. These are the types of things that are being used. So it isn't the type of delicate situation that we might have with other species. I originally worked with American ginseng, for instance. We never would show like a harvest location for that particular species because it does cause issues. But in this case, it's just a little bit different. And we certainly wouldn't highlight, I guess, honestly, the tribal members themselves, in some ways, we did an article for the Payson Post and we're like, this is the acorn capital. So it kind of is a different type of information, I should say, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, in the interest of time, so a couple questions came in for Anna, but she did answer those already online. So a couple of questions have come in for Megan. So Megan, this person is a bit surprised to see invasive species, plant or animal, ranked so highly among your respondents. Any comments on that?
Yeah, that was really about two things. One is about the invasive species that we experience in our riparian systems that sort of block channels and take up a lot of the water. So things like tamarisk and arundo. They can also change fire regimes in those systems. Arundo in particular burns very readily, and it creates a lot of problems. So that was one place people were worried about invasives, is sort of the ecological, hydrological impacts and habitat, because we have a lot of threatened and endangered species in the riparian systems. The other invasive species component was more broadly across the landscape, thinking about how what we experience is an overly frequent fire regime here in Southern California in most of our shrublands. So we're dominated by shrublands. They theoretically should be burning somewhere around 30 to 100 years, but with 24 million people here and a lot of unintended ignitions, it means that in some places we're burning much more frequently. And what happens is we see a vegetation type conversion from those shrublands to non-native annual grasslands. So that's the other invasive problem that people are concerned about, is that whole conversion has a lot of impacts on, soil stability, habitat condition, a bunch of other ecosystem services. But that's really where that came from and where our managers' minds were when they brought up that as a top concern.
Thanks, Megan. And hopefully this is a quick answer on this one to you, Megan. For the Elkhorn Slough, was irrigation done with salt water or fresh water?
That's not me.
That would be Anna, sorry, and we'll follow up with Anna to get an answer to that.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I apologize.
I can give you an answer, but it's probably wrong.
Okay, thanks. This one is specifically for you, Megan, and I think it's the last question we'll be taking. How do you anticipate future effects on your drought response strategies of cuts in federal funding?
Great question. It's part of the reason we approach this and a lot of the other projects that we've been doing as big scale partnerships and communities of practice and sort of relationship and capacity building, because right now it's federal funding, it might be state funding, it might be some other capacity issue that comes up somewhere else. And really these kinds of events, these kinds of situations highlight the importance of partnerships, where if one partner can't get things done for whatever reason, there's something challenging them, blocking their way, we can help, partners can help step in and provide support and services. And we've been seeing that in the work that we do related to forest management and fire. So it's really about lifting each other up. Partnerships are about an ebb and flow and helping, because we all have the same goal of having more resilient landscapes. So by working together, that's how we're planning. And that's why we're doing this as a collaborative and partnership-based project, is because together we can help sort of maintain momentum regardless of what is changing around us, because we never are relieved of that obligation to take care of the lands where we live and work and that we benefit from on a daily basis.
Great, thank you so much. One last thank you to all of our speakers today, Sara, Diana, Anna, and Megan. And on behalf of NIDIS and the National CASC program, thanks to all of you who decided to spend a bit more than an hour with us today. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you again on October 16th for the next webinar in this series. Take care, everybody.